Today we tell the story of Persia, a land where humanity first attempted to bind faith and power, order and justice. You will hear of Cyrus the Great, the ruler who forged the world's first empire, of Darius, who transformed it into a state of reason and law, and of Xerxes, whose campaigns reshaped the fate of Europe. This is the tale of Persia's rise and decline, of triumphs and tragedies, of an ancient flame that refused to die, even after the last king had fallen. Suggest new topics in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Here we talk about history, from ancient legends to modern tales, from historical facts to mysterious plots. Make yourself comfortable. We begin.
Between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf lay a land of mountains, valleys, and rare rivers, a land where since ancient times people built their settlements near springs and caravan roads. This land had no name yet, but it already connected east and west. Traders from Babylon, from India, and from the distant steppes passed through it. The harsh climate made life difficult, yet it was here that societies were born, hardened by effort and bound by a deep belief in order. Among the stone ridges of the Zagros and the fertile plains of Susiana, the first cities appeared, and slowly, in this land, the character of future Persia began to take shape, a world where a person felt part of a great, demanding landscape, one they were not meant to conquer, but to understand. Long before anyone spoke the name of Cyrus, caravans traveled these lands, carrying gold, spices, fabrics, and myths from the valleys of India toward the shores of the Mediterranean. The first to leave true marks of statehood were the Elamites. Their capital, Susa, stood among fertile plains. 1,000 years before Cyrus was born, they already knew writing, built temples, and decorated their walls with images of gods. Elamite kings called themselves lords of the four corners of the world. Their rule did not stretch as far as that of their successors, but they established something essential, a belief in order, in the divine origin of power, and in the idea that governance must be a continuation of the world, not its disruption. But Persia itself grew from other roots. Around the second half of the second millennium BC, when the old powers of Mesopotamia were fading, a new people arrived, the Aryans, whose descendants would spread across India, Iran, and the great eastern steppes. They spoke a language from which Sanskrit and Avestan would later arise. They offered fire in sacrifice, honored the sun, and believed that a person must live in truth. Their gods were simple and stern, Ahura Mazda, creator of light and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of deception and destruction. Between them unfolded an eternal struggle. By choosing the side of good, a human became a partner in creation. These ideas, born in the steppes, became the foundation of what would later become Zoroastrianism, the spiritual heart of Persia. At first, the Aryans lived in small clans, united by blood and ritual. Their lives depended on water. Settlements stretched along the rivers Karun and Kanke, where the land allowed barley, wheat, and grapes to grow. Homes were built from clay, with a fire at the center, the symbol of the clan, a flame that could not be extinguished. Men tended livestock and forged weapons. Women wove cloth and baked bread. Elders settled disputes. Children listened to tales of heroes who rose to the gods. In these tales lived the names of ancient righteous men who fought not for power, but for justice. This inner ethic would one day become the backbone of the Persian state. With time, clans united. In the north rose Media, a powerful kingdom in the mountains where the borders of modern Iran and Armenia meet. Its capital, Ecbatana, was surrounded by 7 walls, each painted a different color, from white to gold, like steps ascending toward the royal palace. The Medes forged an army, united many irradiating tribes, and established order in lands long torn by conflict. They defeated Assyria, the fearsome conquerors of Mesopotamia, and for a brief moment they became the new power of the East. But Median power rested not only on swords, it relied on ancient traditions of councils of nobles and priests, where the law was sacred and the king its guardian. To the south, in the land called Pars, lived the Persians, one of the peoples subject to the Medes. Their lands lay in valleys surrounded by the Zagros Mountains. They possessed no great wealth, yet their endurance and courage were renowned. They were famed for their horses, their smiths, and their skill in fighting through mountain passes. Around the small settlements near Anshan lived a clan that called itself the Achaemenids, descendants of an ancestral forebear named Achaemenid. This memory of an ancestral founder became the basis of their authority, for every chief of this line saw himself as the continuer of an ancient covenant to protect the land and the honor of the tribe. The Persians remained under Median rule for centuries. They paid tribute, sent warriors, but kept their customs and language. Their leaders knew how to wait. They understood that Media was strong, but that its power rested on fear and gold, not on faith. Among the common people, stories spread about a coming age when Persia would rise and bring justice to the world. Elders told children that from the line of the Achaemenids would come a man who would unite all lands and establish a kingdom of righteousness. Thus a vision formed in the minds of the people, a belief in a chosen ruler, strong yet just, an idea that would become the foundation of the future empire. The world around them was full of danger. To the west stood Assyria, a brutal power that razed cities and carried nations into captivity. To the east lived nomads who raided settlements and seized livestock. Between these threats, the peoples of Iran learned to defend themselves. They built fortresses, armed horsemen, and raised temples and altars where the sacred fire never died. All this prepared the ground for a new era, one in which strength and faith would unite in a single person. By the mid-5th century BC, the Median kingdom had reached great power. Its ruler, Astyages, governed vast lands and saw himself as equal to the kings of Babylon. But within his realm, decay had already begun, and in one of its southern provinces, in Persia, there lived a young nobleman named Cyrus, heir of the Achaemenid line, raised in the court of Astyages. He would soon change the world, but for now Persia was only preparing for that moment, gathering strength, preserving the memory of its gods, and believing that one day its land would become the heart of the world. Thus began the story of Persia, a land where power grew from faith, and faith from the earth itself, from stone, from fire, from labor. Here was born a people destined to unite East and West and forever reshape the face of the ancient world.
When the sun rose over the southern ridges of Media, across the land of Pars, no one yet knew that from these harsh valleys would emerge a man destined to unite the world under a single crown. His name was Cyrus, son of Cambyses, born of the Achaemenid line. His mother came from Median nobility, and in his childhood he often appeared at the court of King Astyages in Ecbatana. Many tales survive about his birth, each nation telling the story in its own way. The Greeks wrote that Astyages dreamt of a vine growing from his daughter's womb and covering the whole east. Terrified, he ordered the infant to be killed, but a servant spared the child and carried him to a shepherd. The Persians, however, told another story, that Cyrus was blessed by the gods, and that the fire burning at his birth did not consume the house, but illuminated it with sacred light. Whatever the myth, one thing is clear. Even during his lifetime, people felt in Cyrus not merely a chief, but a man carrying a unique destiny. His youth unfolded among mountains and wide plains, where boys learned from early childhood horse riding, archery, and the importance of keeping one's word. He listened to the elders' songs about ancient heroes, just kings, and gods who punished falsehood. Later, when Cyrus became king, these lessons formed the core of his rule. He often said that a ruler must be honest, for lies destroy a state faster than the sword. His rise coincided with the decline of Media. Astyages, once strong, became suspicious and cruel. He relied on the nobility, but did not trust them, and discontent grew within his court. When Cyrus inherited Persia, he formally remained a vassal, but very quickly became an independent ruler. The Persians followed him willingly, for he understood what they needed. He reduced taxes, allowed warriors to hold land, supported priests and artisans. A new power began to form around him. Around the mid-6th century BC, a revolt erupted in Media. Chroniclers say it was started by Harpagus, a seasoned commander once close to Astyages, but humiliated for disobedience. Harpagus forged a secret pact with Cyrus and called the Persian clans to rise. When Astyages learned of the uprising, he gathered his army and marched against Persia, but the soldiers, weary of his tyranny, defected to Cyrus. The decisive battle took place near Pasargadae. Astyages was captured, but Cyrus did not kill him. According to tradition, he had the former king taken aside and allowed to live. This act was remembered. It was the first sign of a new form of rule, where mercy was not weakness, but part of strength. Thus, Cyrus united Media and Persia into a single kingdom. For the first time, lands from the Xerxes to the Persian Gulf were under one authority. He moved the capital to Pasargadae, raised on the site of his great victory, and built a palace surrounded by gardens and canals. Among the hills he erected his tomb, a simple stone chamber on terraced platforms, where his body would later rest. There was no gold, only white stone, pure as memory. An inscription carved years later read, "I am Cyrus, King of Kings, an Achaemenid." But Cyrus did not remain fixed on the east. His gaze turned westward, towards wealthy Lydia, the land of gold and trade, ruling all of Asia Minor. Its king, Croesus, famed for his wealth and allied with the Greek cities, decided to attack Persia before it grew stronger. Cyrus assembled his army and marched to meet him. They faced each other near Sardis, among hills and vineyards. The Persians moved quickly.
Cyrus used camels to frighten the Lydian cavalry and won the battle. Croesus hid within the fortress, but after a brief siege, he was captured. Legend says that Croesus, as he stood upon a pyre, Cyrus approached and asked, "What do you say now?" Croesus replied, "Remember Solon," referring to the Greek sage who taught, "No one is happy until life is over." Cyrus understood and ordered the flames extinguished. Afterwards, he often took counsel with Croesus, keeping him at court as an advisor. After subduing Lydia, Cyrus turned to the eastern lands, Bactria, Sogdia, and the nomadic nations roaming the steppes. He did not destroy their settlements. He made alliances, demanding only loyalty and tribute. Within a few years, vast territories from the Indian mountains to the Mediterranean coast came under his rule. But his greatest conquest was Babylon, the heart of the ancient world, a city with 1,000 years of history. Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, a scholarly, devout king, but disconnected from his people. He honored the moon god Sin, earning hostility from the priests of Marduk. When the Persian army approached, the gates opened without a fight. It was autumn, 539 BC. Cyrus entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In the famous Cyrus cylinder, found by archaeologists, he declared, "I returned peoples to their lands. I restored temples and allowed the gods to return to their shrines." This document is often called the first charter of the rights of nations. Cyrus released the Jews from Babylonian captivity, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. For this, his name became honored far beyond Persia. In the Bible, he was called the Lord's Anointed. For Cyrus, it was simply order, the world functioning as it should. He believed rule must stand not on fear, but on respect, and that the gods of all peoples deserve honor. In building his empire, Cyrus did not impose a single faith or language. He preserved local laws, appointed satraps from native nobility, and ensured the roads were open so caravans could travel safely. This was his genius. He knew an empire cannot live by violence, it needs justice. Thus he was called not only king, but King of Kings, one who governed not people, but the very order of the world. The last years of his life spent campaigning in the northeast. Beyond the steppes and rivers lived the Massagetae, a warrior people led by Queen Tomiris. Legend says Cyrus fought them and fell in battle. When his body was found, the queen had a skin filled with blood and said, "You wanted blood, drink your fill." But Persians told another story, that he died in his tent, blessing his warriors and leaving his son Cambyses a final command, to defend truth and never exalt himself above the people. Thus ended the life of the man who created the world's first empire. He left behind no ruins of terror, only roads, cities, and a memory that power can be an extension of justice. His realm stretched from the mountains of India to the Aegean Sea, and nowhere were there uprisings, for his name inspired respect, not fear. In the sands of Pasargadae, his tomb still stands. When Alexander the Great came to Persia, he entered the tomb and stood in silence. On the sarcophagus was carved, "Man, whoever you are, know that I was Cyrus, King of Kings. Do not envy me, but remember." Thus the age of foundation ended, and a new age began, the time of Darius, architect of empire, who would turn Cyrus's conquests into a perfected order.
After the death of Cyrus, the empire he created remained vast, but fragile. Its borders stretched from the Indus to Egypt, from the Caucasus to the shores of Asia Minor, a land of dozens of nations, traditions and languages, a world in need not of another conqueror, but of a builder capable of turning this enormous realm into a single living organism. After the short and troubled reign of Cambyses, power passed to a young commander of Achaemenid blood, Darius. He did not inherit the throne by direct succession. Cambyses died during a campaign in Syria, and a man claiming to be his brother seized power. Darius, serving in the royal guard of the Immortals, rose in rebellion and took the palace within 20 days. Chronicles tell that after his victory, he gathered the 6 nobles who had aided him and proposed they decide what form of government Persia should have: rule by the people, rule by the aristocracy, or rule by a single king. After long debate, they agreed that the power of one just ruler was the best path. Thus began the reign of Darius, an age that became a symbol of order that would outlive centuries. Darius inherited a realm trembling with unrest. Babylon declared independence. Media rose in rebellion. Egypt refused to pay tribute. The young king acted decisively, dividing the army into detachments, personally leading campaigns, and crushing the uprisings within a single year. In his inscriptions he wrote, "I restored order that had been ruined by the lie. By the will of Ahura Mazda, I gave peace to the land again." These were not empty words. To Darius, deceit and disorder were crimes against the very fabric of the world. Once stability returned, he turned to the task of governance. Knowing that an empire of such size could not be ruled from a single palace, he divided it into 20 satrapies, administrative regions, each with its own governor, tax collector, and military commander. The satraps answered directly to the king, but enjoyed wide autonomy. To prevent abuse, he created special officials, the king's eye and ear, who traveled the empire to inspect local authorities. For the first time in history, Persia gained a system of oversight comparable to that of a modern state. He introduced a unified currency, the gold darik, named after him. Merchants from the Nile to the mountains of India now used the same coin, turning Persia into the economic heart of the ancient world. He measured lands, established taxes, and created a transparent registry of tribute. Every satrapy knew what it owed, strengthening trust in the crown. At the same time, Darius began monumental construction projects. In the mountains of Fars, he ordered raised a new city, Persepolis, the city of the Persians. It was not merely a residence, but a sacred symbol of the empire. Its halls were adorned with reliefs depicting nations bearing gifts to the king: Babylonians with cloth, Egyptians with gold, Indians with elephants, Medes with horses. Each figure calm, dignified, in harmony. A message carved in stone, that the rule of Darius rested not on terror, but on agreement. He built roads, too, knowing that connection is the foundation of power. From Sardis, in Asia Minor, to Susa, he constructed the Royal Road, more than 2,000 kilometers long. Couriers could ride along it, changing horses at stations every 25 kilometers. Messages that once took months now arrived within days. Herodotus wrote, "There is nothing in the world that stops the king's couriers, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor the darkness of night." This road became the artery that bound the empire together. He built a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, long before the Suez. On a stone along its banks he inscribed, "I united the sea on which ships sail with the river that flows towards Persia." This allowed Persian vessels to reach India and Africa, making the empire master of trade routes. Under Darius, arts and crafts flourished. In Susa and Persepolis worked artisans from every nation, carving bull-headed columns, shaping glazed tiles, casting coins, and cutting stones so precisely that seams vanished. Darius admired skill, and often spoke with his architects. Legend says he once remarked, "That which is built by reason endures longer than that which is taken by the sword." He expanded the empire, though like Cyrus, his wars were cautious and measured. Thrace, part of India, islands of the Aegean, lands around the Black Sea, all became part of Persia. But Darius did not seek destruction, he sought stability, aiming to bring new lands into the greater order he forged. On the cliffs of Behustan, he carved historian to stone in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It became a political manifesto, declaring, "Ahura Mazda granted me the kingdom. I rule by truth. He who is not faithful to truth is my enemy." 60 meters above the ground, the inscription still bears witness to how Persia transformed from a collection of nations into a unified state. Darius was visible, yet never tyrannical. He accepted tribute standing, without a throne. He dressed simply. He refused to be depicted as a god. And when courtiers tried to praise him like a deity, he answered, "I am king of men, not of gods. If I am just, it is because I follow their law." This balance of dignity and restraint earned him admiration even beyond Persia. But his final years were shadowed by threats in the west. In Asia Minor, the Ionian Greeks rebelled. Darius crushed the revolt, but realized that the Greek cities, united by their fierce love of independence, would become a new danger. He prepared a campaign against mainland Greece, a campaign that would be carried out not by him, but by his son Xerxes, and would mark the beginning of a new era, the clash of 2 civilizations. Darius died in old age, leaving behind an empire the world had never seen, founded on 3 pillars: order, faith, and the road. He was not a poet like Cyrus, but a lawgiver whose ideas outlived empires. Thus ended the age of creation, and began the age of trials, when Persia would first learn the meaning of limits.
When Darius died, his son Xerxes was still young. He did not inherit merely an empire. He inherited a mechanism that stretched across half the known world and a name that demanded greatness. Raised at court, surrounded by powerful nobles, Xerxes learned early that power was not a reward, but a trial. His mother, Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, ensured that her son would become heir, even though Darius had older children. Thus, before he ever wore the crown, Xerxes lived in the heart of palace intrigues, learning to hide emotion behind composure. The first years of his reign were peaceful. He continued the construction of Persepolis, embellished the palaces of Susa, repaired roads and temples. But the memory of the Greek revolt in Ionia and Persia's defeat at Marathon still burned in the heart of every warrior. Darius had died before avenging that blow, and the duty now lay upon his son. His commanders, especially Mardonius, urged him onward, to conquer Greece, to restore the honor of the empire, to secure Persia's rule over Asia Minor. Xerxes hesitated. He knew such a campaign would devour men and gold, and that Greece was a land of free citizens, men who fought not for kings, but for their own city. But messengers brought tales of easy riches and glory. At last he chose to act. The preparations were unprecedented. From every corner of the empire came soldiers, Persians, Medes, Egyptians,
Indians, even tribes from the Caucasus. Ancient writers spoke of more than 2 million men, though real numbers were far smaller. Still the greatest host the ancient world had ever seen. Xerxes ordered a bridge to be built across the Hellespont, linking Asia and Europe. A storm destroyed the first attempt, and in anger, as Herodotus tells, he commanded the sea to be chained and whipped for daring to defy the King of Kings. A second bridge was built. Anchors sunk deep into the strait, planks laid across, earth piled atop, and the army marched over the water. A canal was carved through Mount Athos so the fleet could avoid deadly storms. The message was clear: Persia would bend nature itself to the will of its ruler. When the army advanced, the earth trembled under the step of multitudes. Infantry and wagons filled one road, the fleet shadowed the coastline, and festivals greeted them in every city they passed. Xerxes rode in a chariot, surrounded by the 10,000 immortals, glittering armor, silver spearheads, golden ornaments. The Greeks knew the invasion was coming. Unable to match such numbers, they chose unity. Sparta and Athens, rivals for centuries, now stood side by side. They selected the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a place where numbers meant nothing. When Xerxes arrived, he expected them to flee. They did not. A messenger demanded their surrender. The Spartans answered, "Come and take them." For 3 days the Persians attacked, and 3 days the Greeks held. Leonidas and his 7,000 allies fought as if they were 10 times their number. Only treachery, a hidden mountain path revealed by a local, decided the battle. Leonidas dismissed most of his allies, remaining with just 300 Spartans and a small band of Thebans. They fought to the last. Xerxes, moved by their bravery, ordered Leonidas to be buried with honor. The road to Greece lay open. Persia seized Athens, its temples burned, its statues shattered, but the people had already fled to Salamis. There, in the narrow strait, their fleet waited. Xerxes, believing the victory assured, commanded an attack. But the narrow waters negated Persia's numbers. Greek ships, smaller and swifter, rammed the crowded Phoenician vessels. Soon, chaos erupted. Shattered hulls, fire on the waves, shouts swallowed by smoke. From a golden throne upon the cliffs, Xerxes watched his fleet collapse. He understood then the gods of Greece had denied him mastery. He retreated, leaving Mardonius with a strong army, but the next year, at Plataea, Persia was defeated once more. On the same day, their fleet fell at Mycale. Thus ended the greatest expedition in Persian history, born of ambition, ended in the lesson of limits. Xerxes' return to Persia changed. He withdrew from war, devoting himself to palaces, temples, and ceremonies. He completed the great Apadana at Persepolis, restored Egypt, and continued the ancient policy of tolerance. But within the palace, luxury spread, and with it, distrust. Intrigue poisoned the court, and power became decadence. Xerxes was murdered by a palace eunuch. His death became the symbol of a fading golden age. The empire remained vast and mighty, but the spirit that once filled it, the spirit of Cyrus and Darius, began to weaken. The columns of Persepolis still stood, yet the meaning behind them dimmed. Persia, once striving to unite the world, now learned that even the strongest power has limits, and that authority without faith becomes only the shadow of itself.
After the death of Xerxes, Persia still stood as the mightiest power of the East. Its royal roads linked seas and mountains. Its palaces glimmered with gold, and its kings called themselves rulers of all nations. But behind that splendor, shadows were forming. The power once forged by Cyrus and Darius, built on duty, courage, and truth, was now slipping into the hands of those who saw the throne not as a burden of responsibility, but as a fountain of pleasure. The empire still lived, yet a fracture, deep and silent, was beginning to spread. When Xerxes died, the throne passed to his son Artaxerxes I. He inherited a vast and restless dominion. Babylon rose in rebellion, Egypt stirred again, and every general he sent to restore order found himself fighting not only enemies, but corruption. Bribes, whispers, and courtly intrigue spoke louder than laws. Artaxerxes tried to rebuild the old order. He reformed taxes, strengthened the roads, and calmed rebellions. Yet the influence of nobles grew unchecked. Persia was slowly becoming a land ruled not by a single will, but by 1,000 competing hands. Meanwhile, far to the west, Greece was locked in the Peloponnesian War. Persia watched with cold amusement. Artaxerxes supported first one side, then the other, feeding both with gold and ships to weaken them equally. He became a silent puppet master of the Hellenic world, and when Greece finally exhausted itself, Persian influence in Asia Minor rose once more. But Persia's inner weakness grew with every passing year. After Artaxerxes came Darius II, a reign drowned in court intrigues, scheming nobles, and powerful eunuchs. Even provincial governors, the satraps, acted like independent kings. Some minted their own coins, some forged alliances without the crown's permission. The empire, once unified, began to crumble from within. Then came Artaxerxes III. His brother Cyrus the Younger rebelled, marched on the throne, and fell in battle at Cunaxa. His Greek mercenaries, the famous 10,000, fought their way home across mountains and deserts, leaving behind stories of Persia's wealth and Persia's growing fragility. The next king, Artaxerxes III, tried to restore strength through fear. He crushed satraps, retook Egypt, purged rivals, but the empire was already tired. At court, luxury replaced discipline. Banquets replaced councils. The gold once used to build an empire was now spent on singers, festivals, and bribes. When Artaxerxes III was murdered by his eunuch Bagoas, no one dared avenge him. Power had become a prize, not a sacred duty. Young Xerxes took the throne, only to be poisoned soon after. Bagoas then set up Darius III, a man of good birth, brave in his youth, but ruling an empire whose unity had already crumbled. Rebellions flared in Egypt, satraps quarreled in Asia Minor, bandits roamed the royal roads. Darius tried to restore order, but trust in the crown was broken. And at that very moment, far in the northwest, a new power began to rise. A young Macedonian king, laughed at by many, crossed the Hellespont on the very waters where Xerxes once marched to glory. His name was Alexander. Persia did not yet believe he was a threat. Why should they? For centuries their kings thought destiny bowed before them as easily as their courtiers did. But the world had changed, and Persia did not notice. Thus began the twilight. An empire born from faith in order was now losing that order from within. Intrigue corroded loyalty, gold outweighed law, fear replaced honor. And though royal pillars still towered over Persepolis and coins still bore the name of Darius, the spirit that once united nations from India to the Mediterranean was fading. When Alexander finally appeared on the horizon, Persia did not fall from foreign strength. It fell from its own exhaustion. All that remained was greatness turned into shadow.
When spring came in 334 BCE, and Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the world, it seemed, finally closed a great circle. The young Macedonian king, just 22, led an army hardened by discipline and bound by a fierce belief in destiny. His ships carried no gold, but something far more dangerous, unshakable confidence that fate itself walked beside him. At first, the Persians did not take his expedition seriously. Darius III believed the Macedonians were mere northern barbarians, incapable of challenging an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. But the very first clash proved the age had changed. At the river Granicus, near the coast of Asia Minor, Alexander faced the Persian satraps. Their forces were numerous but divided, and the young king led the charge himself. A Persian blade struck his helmet, splitting the metal, but sparing his life. His soldiers saw it as a sign. Their king was protected by the gods. Victory opened the way into Asia Minor. Sardis surrendered without a fight. Ephesus opened its gates. Within months, all the western provinces of Persia fell under Macedonian control. Darius gathered a new army. By the autumn of 333 BCE, he marched north, and on the plain of Issus, the two kings finally met. The Persian army was larger, but the narrow land between mountains and sea robbed it of advantage. Alexander struck the center, driving straight toward Darius's chariot, and forced the great king to flee. The battlefield was Macedonian. Into Alexander's hands fell the royal family. Darius's mother, his wife, and daughters. He touched none of them, ordering they be treated with honor. This act alone convinced many Persians that Alexander was not mere a conqueror, but a king worthy of respect. Darius sent envoys offering peace, lands west of the Euphrates, a vast ransom, even his daughter's hand. Alexander refused. He said, "The land and the sea belong to the one strong enough to rule them." And he continued forward. Next came Tyre, the proud Phoenician island fortress. The siege lasted 7 months. A causeway was built, towers raised, fleets battled in burning waters. When the city fell, Alexander allowed his soldiers their victory, but spared the temple of Melkart, the god the Greeks called Heracles. Then Egypt opened its arms to him. In the oasis of Siwa, the oracle proclaimed him son of Amun, the sun god. From that moment, he believed his destiny was to unite East and West. Darius assembled one final army, vast,
legendary in size. On the plain of Gaugamela he waited, a wide level field prepared for war, his chariots given every advantage, but the Macedonians formed their troops into a razor-sharp wedge aimed directly at the great king himself. Chariots thundered forward, but the Macedonians parted, letting them pass, striking from both sides. Then Alexander charged the Persian center. Darius's guard fell one by one, and the king fled again. Gaugamela decided the fate of the empire. Darius escaped to Ecbatana, then east into Bactria. Alexander entered Babylon, then Susa, and at last Persepolis. Babylon welcomed him with blessings. In Susa, he found treasures collected over 2 centuries. In Persepolis, he found a kingdom carved in stone, reliefs of nations bringing tribute, endless columns, the legacy of Darius and Xerxes. But here, in a drunken moment of triumph, came the act that symbolized Persia's end. At a feast, someone urged him to burn Xerxes' palace as revenge for the burning of Athens. Alexander refused, then yielded. He took a torch and set the draperies aflame. The heart of Persia burned. By morning, nothing could be saved. A new age began in smoke. Darius still lived, barely. Betrayed by his own satrap Bessus, he was carried into the deserts of Hyrcania. When the Macedonians approached, Bessus stabbed him and fled. Alexander found the king dying. According to legend, Darius spoke, "I thank you for your mercy to my family. Avenge me and rule with justice." Alexander buried him as a king, calling him the last righteous ruler of Persia. With Darius's death, the great empire ceased to exist, but Alexander understood, to rule Persia, he must become part of it. He preserved the administration, kept satraps in place, honored Zoroastrian temples and traditions. He married Roxana of Bactria, later arranging mass marriages between Macedonians and Persian women to bind the 2 worlds by blood. But his soldiers grumbled. Their king dressed like a Persian, accepted Persian rituals, and in their eyes became something foreign. Alexander dreamed of a united world, but that world was too vast even for him. He pushed into Sugdania, then India, until his men refused to march any farther. He returned to Babylon with new plans, roads, reforms, a unified currency, a blended empire. But time abandoned him. At 32, he died, leaving behind not only an empire, but a question without an answer. Persia became part of the Hellenistic world. Its cities, Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana, fell under new rulers, but among its people lived a memory of the law of light, of kings who ruled with justice, of a land that once united East and West. Its palaces were shattered, its empire gone, but its idea, the belief in righteous order, in the dignity of work, in the wisdom of the king, endured.
After the death of Alexander, the great world he had forged by the sword began to crumble almost at once. His commanders, the Diadochi, carved the empire apart, each claiming a portion as his own. In the east, in the lands where the palaces of the Achaemenids had once risen over the plains, the Seleucids, descendants of Seleucus, one of Alexander's closest companions, held power. They adopted Greek language, customs, and architecture.
Yet behind the facade of Hellenistic splendor, the memory of old Persia lived on. In the temples, the sacred fire still burned, priests still recited prayers in the Avestan tongue, and in the hearts of the people lived the hope that one day a king would rise again by the will of Mazda. A century passed and the prophecy began to take form. In the northeast, in a region known as Parthia, among hills and steppe lived nomadic tribes, famed for their riders and their harsh endurance. One clan among them, the Sassanids, would soon change the destiny of the East. Around the middle of the 3rd century BC, a chieftain named Xerxes rose in rebellion. He gathered his warriors, expelled the Seleucid governor, and declared independence. Thus began the age of the Parthian kingdom, heirs to ancient Persia, keepers of its martial flame. In their early decades, Parthia lived in constant war. The Seleucids marched east every year, determined to reclaim their lost province, but the Parthians fought differently. They did not stand in heavy ranks. They vanished into the open land, striking like the wind itself. Their light cavalry, swift horses, short bows appeared from nowhere, loosed volleys of arrows, and disappeared into the horizon. It became their signature, the legendary Parthian shot, a rider feigning retreat, turning in the saddle to fire backward with lethal precision. Under King Mithridates I, in the late 2nd century BC, Parthia became a true empire. He conquered Media, Persia, Babylonia, even parts of ancient Elam. His armies entered Seleucia on the Tigris, restoring Iranian rule to Mesopotamia for the first time since the Achaemenids. Mithridates took the title King of Kings, reviving the ancient glory of Cyrus and Darius. But in the west, Rome was rising. After defeating Carthage and Macedon, Rome advanced east, and soon the two great powers collided. The first major clash came under King Orodes II. The Roman general Crassus, dreaming of repeating Alexander's marches, invaded Mesopotamia. He underestimated the Parthians and paid dearly for it. At Carrhae, Serena, a Parthian noble and brilliant commander, encircled the Roman legions. Arrows darkened the sky, and when the Romans faltered, Parthian cataphracts, armored riders sheathed in iron from head to hoof, crushed the lines. Crassus fell, and Rome suffered one of its worst defeats. From that moment, Parthia stood as the one power capable of halting Rome itself. Treaties were signed. The Euphrates became the frontier. A centuries-long struggle for Armenia and Syria began, a silent duel between East and West. Inside Parthia, power belonged not only to the king, but to the great noble families, each commanding its own armies and lands. It made the state flexible and fragile. Strong kings unified it, weak kings watched it fracture. Yet culture flourished. Caravans carried silk from China, spices from India, glass from Syria, furs from the northern steppes. Cities like Nisa and Ctesiphon became crossroads of civilization. Greek temples stood beside Zoroastrian fire shrines. Inscriptions appeared in Greek and Parthian. Art blended East and West into a style found nowhere else. Rome returned in force at the turn of the new era. Mark Antony invaded and failed. Emperor Trajan marched deep into Parthian lands, captured Babylon and Seleucia, yet withdrew when revolt swept the region. The frontier stabilized again along the Euphrates. But by the late 2nd century AD, internal strife consumed Parthia. Noble houses fought one another, and in the south, in Fars, the ancient homeland of Cyrus, a new leader arose, Ardashir. He vowed to restore Iran's ancient purity, its faith, its order, its kingship. Few took him seriously at first, but he defeated local governors, then marched north and crushed the last Parthian king, Artaban's. In 224 AD, Ardashir entered Ctesiphon and was proclaimed King of Kings. The Parthian age ended. The Sasanian era began. Yet the Parthians did not vanish. They preserved ancient Persian ideals, the belief that a king must guard truth, not merely wield power. They halted Rome's advance, protected the East from conquest, and kept alive the flame of Iranian civilization. So ended the age of the Parthians, an age in which ancient Persia did not die, but changed its form, waiting for its next dawn.
When Ardashir I rose to the throne in the year 224 CE, his realm was still modest, yet within it flickered a will to restore an ancient glory. He came from a noble family of Fars, the very heartland of old Persia, where the stones of Persepolis still shimmered under the desert sun, and where, as the priests believed, the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda had never gone out. His father had served as a temple priest, and so, from the very first day, Ardashir's power carried a sacred weight. He declared that kingship was not merely rule over men, but the earthly reflection of a divine order. In the early years he fought the last Parthian lords, seeking to unite the land. His decisive victory over King Artabanus opened the path to a new empire. Ardashir entered Ctesiphon in triumph, the ancient capital by the Tigris, and there the throne of the King of Kings shone once again. He proclaimed the beginning of a new dynasty, the house of the Sasanians, said to descend from the same line as the Achaemenids themselves. Thus, his rule was seen not as a beginning, but a restoration. From its birth, the Sasanian realm stood on two pillars, a strong central authority and a revived sacred faith. Zoroastrianism became the state religion once more. Priests, the Mobeds, guided both court and kingdom. Across the land, fire temples rose again, their eternal flames burning day and night as symbols of truth and cosmic order. After Ardashir, power passed to his son, Shapur I, a warrior and a statesman of great vision. He strengthened the borders, built new cities, and confronted the Roman Empire with boldness. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, he captured the Roman Emperor Valerian, a moment unmatched in the long history of Rome. Shapur commemorated this triumph on the cliffs of Naksh Rustam, the king on horseback, Valerian kneeling, and above them Ahura Mazda, granting the symbol of royal power. But Shapur was more than a conqueror. He opened the empire to scholars from India and Syria, founded academies, and made Gundashapur a center of learning, a place where physicians, mathematicians, and philosophers shared knowledge across cultures. Yet after his death, unrest followed. Only under Khosrow I, Anushirvan, the immortal soul, did the empire regain its order and strength. He reformed taxation, restored justice, rebuilt roads and canals, and fortified the frontiers. Chroniclers wrote that he listened to the complaints of common people daily and demanded that trials be ruled not by birth, but by fairness. Against Byzantium, Khosrow acted with cold precision. His armies took Antioch and reached the Mediterranean. Yet he spared conquered cities, resettled their people kindly, and allowed their faiths to flourish. Under the Sasanians, culture blossomed. Zoroastrianism grew stronger, but other schools, Manichaeans, Greek philosophers, also found their voice. Craftsmen forged crowns of gold, mosaics of animals, and carpets of such beauty that later conquerors would marvel at them in disbelief. Then came the reign of Khosrow I, the last great flare of Persian splendor. His armies swept through Syria, took Jerusalem, and carried away the true cross, the holiest relic of Christendom. Persian banners reached Egypt, Armenia, and the empire stood once more at the borders of ancient glory. But beneath the triumphs was exhaustion. Wars drained the treasury, taxes rose, and the royal court drowned in luxury. Parvis built gardens, held endless feasts, and ceased to hear the counsel of wiser men. When Emperor Heraclius struck back, the Persian armies were no longer what they had been. Defeat followed defeat. In 628 CE, Parvis was overthrown and slain by his own son. In the years that followed, rulers changed with frightening speed. The state wavered, its power eroded by intrigue and uncertainty. And at that very moment, on the southern horizon, a new force was rising: the Arabs, united under the banner of a new faith. But even in those final decades, the old spirit endured. The sacred fire still burned in the temples. The Avesta was still read aloud. Caravans still traveled the ancient roads. The Sasanian Empire became the last great power of the ancient East, the final guardian of Persia's old flame. It carried forward the wisdom of the Achaemenids, the resilience of the Parthians, and the eternal belief that order and truth stand above the sword. And when its time came to an end, the sky over Persepolis shone once more with the last light of ancient Persia, just before a new sun rose over its lands: Islam.
In the early 7th century, when a new faith appeared in the desert of Arabia, no one in Persia took it seriously. The mighty Sasanian Empire, hardened by decades of war with Byzantium, seemed unshakable. In Ctesiphon, the royal capital on the banks of the Tigris, the palaces of Khosrow still gleamed. Music echoed in their halls, and marble walls flickered with the sacred fire of Ahura Mazda. Yet behind this brilliance, decay was already growing. The walls begun by Khosrow Parviz had drained the treasury. The land was exhausted, roads crumbling, and the provinces ruled by satraps who cared more for their own wealth than for the realm. After Khosrow's murder, the throne passed to his son Kawad, but he lasted only briefly. Within a few years, more than 10 rulers rose and fell. Some died in conspiracies, others were overthrown by generals or ambitious nobles. The empire had no center left to hold it together. To the east, Turkic tribes gathered strength. To the west, Byzantium rose again. And to the south, beyond the sands, a new power awakened: the united Arab tribes carrying the message of Islam. After the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, his successors, the caliphs, unified Arabia with discipline and an unyielding faith. Their armies were small but unstoppable. First they struck Byzantium, and then it was Persia's turn. In 633, Arab forces under Khalid ibn al-Walid entered Mesopotamia. Persia tried to stop them near Al-Hira and failed. Soon the young king Yazdegerd III ascended the throne, barely 16, inheriting a kingdom ruined by war and treachery. He called the satraps to unity, sent envoys to China and India seeking allies, but no help came. In 636, the Persian army under Rostam Farrokzad met the Muslims near Babylon. The battle raged for days. War elephants stood in the front lines, but when the wind changed
and a sandstorm struck the Persians in the face, the tide turned. Rostam fell, and the Arabs marched into Ctesiphon. The city of the King of Kings stood abandoned. Yazdegerd fled east, taking with him priests, nobles, and the royal treasures, the sacred fire, the gold, the holy books. But the empire was gone. The Arabs seized Babylon, Susa, Persepolis. 2 years later, at Nahavand, the remains of the Persian army were crushed. Historians would call it the victory of victories, the moment when ancient Persia's fate was sealed. Yazdegerd wandered the eastern lands for years, seeking support, but everyone saw his power was only a shadow. Around 651, he was killed in Merv, according to one account, by a miller who sheltered him. Thus died the last Sasanian king, the final ruler of ancient Persia. With the fall of the Sasanian Empire, a 1,000-year era ended. Islamic rule transformed the land, but it did not erase its culture. The conquerors preserved schools and libraries. Through Persia, the sciences of antiquity flowed into the Islamic world. Zoroastrian priests retreated into the mountains, guarding the sacred flame and chanting ancient hymns. Others sailed east to India, where their descendants, the Parsis, live even today. Though Persia changed its language and faith, its spirit endured. A new Persian culture rose within Islam. New poets, new thinkers, a literature that revived the old symbols of Cyrus, Darius, and Khosrow in transformed, eternal ways. And centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered Persepolis and read Darius's inscriptions, they found words that had survived 1,000 years. I loved truth. I hated lies. I was no friend of evil men. These lines, carved long before the fall, proved prophetic. They remind us that a state stands not on gold or swords, but on justice. Thus ended the story of ancient Persia, a land born from mountain tribes, builder of the world's first empire, survivor of Parthians and Sassanians and the storms of history. It vanished as a kingdom, but not as a soul. Its flame lived on in poetry, in philosophy, in the timeless image of the East where light never dies, but becomes memory. And when today the sun touches the stones of Persepolis, it feels less like farewell and more like a reminder. Great empires fall, but their spirit lives so long as humanity remembers that truth and order outlast all crowns.